Welcome to Energy Unplugged, the go-to podcast focusing on the global energy transition. I am Claudia Günther, Aurora Senior Research Lead for Northwestern Europe. Over the past 3 years, we've returned again and again to one topic: batteries. And for good reason. They've become one of the fastest growing pieces of the energy puzzle. Last year alone, global installed capacity jumped by more than 50%. But here's the twist. When it comes to energy capacity, the actual gigawatt-hours stored, pumped hydro storage still dwarfs everything else. Batteries may be taking the lead in power, but pumped hydro remains the king of stored energy. At least for now. In today's episode, we'll uncover the role of this hidden champion in power systems and compare it to batteries. Are pumped hydro and batteries like David versus Goliath, the small versus the mighty? Or are they better seen as partners in building a flexible, resilient energy future? We'll explore how these technologies differ, the hurdles of developing new projects, and how they compete and cooperate in energy markets. To explore this, we'll draw on insights from Alpiq, a leading Swiss energy company with deep expertise in flexibility solutions, especially in hydropower and pump storage. So I'm very pleased to be joined by my guest, Christoph Bellin, currently Head of Development and Projects at Alpiq, where he's overseeing the storage expansion across Europe. With over 20 years of experience in project development and energy trading, Christoph combines strategic insights with hands-on experience and flexibility, making him the perfect person to speak to for today's episode. Welcome to the show, Christoph.
Thank you very much, Claudia. Thank you very much for the warm words. I'm very pleased to be part of that podcast and looking forward to discuss with you that context.
Christoph, before we dive into today's topic, I'd love to hear more about your career journey. One thing that has caught my attention is that you studied telematics, a field not everyone is familiar with. So for those of our listeners that don't know telematics, could you explain what exactly it is and how it led you into the energy sector?
Yeah, obviously you made your homework and you went back into my history more than 20 years ago. So through my early steps in the professional career was actually in the field of telematics. If you would Google that, I think the term telematics stands for long distance transmission of computerized information. So something which sounds a bit outdated today, but what it was in reality back then was I was dealing with, for instance, laser-based data transmission systems, or where we try to transmit high-speed data over longer distances from point A to point B. Maybe we have to remind ourselves that back then, 25 years ago, so there was no high-speed internet connections available. There was especially no high-speed mobile connections available. So it was a very different world in terms of available technology. And then taking that technology, I was also dealing with the first video streaming or corporate video conferencing systems. So today's world is spiced with Zoom and Teams, which is a very common standard. Back then, this was something very exciting and something also quite costly to deploy in a corporate environment.
So how did you end up at Alpiq?
The honest answer actually is that was a pure coincidence. So after a few years in the telematics, let's say, industry, I was working in a rather small company. So my only goal back then was to try a larger firm, a larger company. So to see how it's working in a larger company. And I had a few options on the table I could choose from back in 2005, I guess. And it was a coincidence of having accepted an offer from a legacy leg of today's Alpiq. And that's how I ended up in the energy industry. It was not a really sophisticated plan, really a coincidence.
Well, it looks like it has worked out well for you. So you said this was in 2005, so 20 years ago. What was the energy landscape like back then?
Yeah, true. Already 20 years ago, so a long time, and it feels like almost hundreds of years in the real world experience. But trying to map a little bit the differences from back then to today. So what I well remember when we look at the actors in the energy market as an example. So back then, electricity production or trading was dominated by utilities. So if one wanted to have an electron of produced electricity, so obviously the utilities would produce it and bring it to the grid. Also back then, unbundling was not done. So it was the early days of unbundling energy production from the grids. So even in our case, we were owning a part of a transmission grid. We were producing electricity. We were trading electricity. So all under one roof. And that, as you know, has fundamentally changed today. Then making maybe the link to, how is the production stack looking like today versus past then? So renewables didn't play a role. So the wind and solar part of the energy production was very, very minor. They didn't really influence the market a lot back then. And therefore also market segments like intraday trading that was barely existent or almost inexistent. And last but not least, of course, my early days were in energy trading. So I remember a bit more the differences there. Take an example like intraday trading markets. This was done over phones, 1-2 trades a day. And if you compare that with today, this is tens of thousands of trades automatically executed over automated exchange platforms. So that really changed very, very much compared to back then. And the result is way more volatility. So the energy landscape is driven by the renewable, but also way more by interconnected markets, global energy markets, so global price signals. Everything is accessible for everyone. Everything, leads into a price change immediately. That was way different back then.
Thanks a lot for sharing. As you've already explained, Alpiq has undergone a remarkable transformation as much of the energy landscape, but I think Alpiq is an especially interesting one because it has gone from being a more traditional utility to being one of Europe's leading flexibility providers. Now, Switzerland is, of course, not the biggest country. Could you explain, especially for our listeners abroad or outside Europe, what Alpiq does and what makes Alpiq special?
Yeah, sure. Alpiq is, let's say, in Swiss dimensions, relatively big, but not so much in European dimensions or even global dimensions. So we are Switzerland's second largest electricity producer, around 1,300 employees, around half of them located in Switzerland, the other half across Western Europe. So our geographical footprint is Europe, Western Europe mainly. The roots of the companies are more than 100 years old. So Alpiq is a merger product which has been created out of two companies, Altel and EOS. But the roots of those companies are very, very old, over a century. Since ever, flexibility or flexible energy production is in our DNA. So even 100 years ago, looking at our business model today, it's kind of three business lines or value chains, as we call it. It's trading or selling electricity out of the power we are generating in our own assets. So the asset-backed perimeter. The second important business line is what we call origination. It's risk management for energy customers, like with products like PPAs or BESS tolling or market access contracts, but also energy supply to large industrial customers. Little side note, Alpiq doesn't have private household customers with the exception of France. So only in France we have a portfolio with household level end customers. The other countries, our customers are industrials, are other energy companies, renewables, owners and operators, and so on. Last business line is trading in our own books, call it prop trading. So it's all the trading activities without a leg into our asset base or without a leg into our customer base. Last but not least, I like to mention our purpose because I really like it. So the purpose of Alpiq is together for a better climate and improvement of security of supply. And when you look at on what we are actually doing in our daily job, but also in our strategy execution, you can always connect our daily doing or also our investments to that purpose. So being a flexibility provider actually means for us that we are enabling the further integration of renewables, which is directly contributing to a better climate, but also it improves the security of supply by providing the needed flexibility to the grid.
Yeah, I think that's a very good point. And I can tell from firsthand experience that Alpiq has been active in this flexibility space for a long time and started investing in battery storage much before the big wave we're seeing now. So I still remember that when we launched our flexibility offering at Aurora, that Alpiq was one of the first companies to be interested in this. What was the strategic vision at Alpiq years, decades back behind these early moves into flexibility?
Yeah, maybe making the quick link to our existing flexibility portfolio. So what's quite remarkable about Alpiq as a flexibility provider is that 80% of our production is actually flexible. So only 20% is non-flexible production. And that means for 80%, we have a say when we want to produce actually energy, and we try to produce whenever there is the highest need. The asset base, conventional asset base, there is pumped hydro storage, and supported by nuclear, supported by thermal and a bit of renewables. And yeah, why batteries and why do batteries play an increasing role in our portfolio is it's a continuation of our path. So we've started with flexibility and we have, let's say, redefined our strategy, and we are pretty confident that we need to continue the path we have started. So we want to complement our existing flexibility portfolio with additional technologies like batteries. So batteries is really something we look at it as a complementary add-on to our existing portfolios. So we are very keen to make further investments in battery energy storage. But not only, we are also looking at other investment opportunities. We are very keen in making other investments in hydropower, in pumped hydropower, whether it's in Switzerland, whether it's outside Switzerland. And battery indeed is just very, very nice complementary element.
That's a perfect transition to our main topic of today. So to compare pumped hydro and battery storage. So surely they share lots of similarities in what they can offer to the power system, ranging from energy arbitrage to balancing the grid, or maybe even helping to restore the network after a blackout. But let's talk now about the differences. So I think there are two quite obvious differences, which are the asset size and the lifetime. And I'm keen on understanding what this means for you as a project developer. So just to give our listeners a feeling, when we're talking about pumped hydro storage, these are usually massive in terms of absolute size. So the power capacity, they vary between, let's say, 100 megawatts to up to more than 3 gigawatts with very long storage durations. So sometimes more than 24 hours, and they can store a lot of energy. So Alpiq actually partially owns one of the largest pumped hydro assets in Switzerland that has close to 1 gigawatt of power capacity and more than 20 gigawatt hours energy capacity, meaning it could provide the largest city of Switzerland with electricity for multiple days. Utility scale batteries, on the other hand, they have traditionally been much smaller, both with respect to power and energy capacity. Of course, we're seeing now a trend upwards with more projects above 100 megawatt, but I think on average, it's still fair to say that they're a smaller asset. So of course, when we talk about the lifetime, this is another big difference. And here I'm really keen on getting your experience as a project developer. What is the key difference for you in developing these projects? So what role do lifetime, asset size, and maybe other criteria play for you?
I think you already mentioned in the introduction that often we look at the battery energy storage as a replacement, for instance, of pumped hydro. And the way we look at it in general is really it's a complementary element, because when we look a little bit on how those projects look like in terms of characteristics, there's still quite some remarkable differences. So making a quick link to our own portfolio, we are those days commissioning our first grid-scale battery. So it's finally built, and it's a 30 megawatt asset in Finland, which is right now producing or consuming the first electrons. whereas our biggest pumped hydro in the portfolio is 900 megawatt, as you mentioned, the 900 megawatt facility. And yes, you're right. So on capacity or power available, batteries are ramping up. So there's an increasing amount of larger scale projects available on the market, whether it's 300 megawatt or 500 megawatts and so on, even bigger. But in terms of energy storage capacity, there's still quite a big gap. So I make a link to a second asset we have in our portfolio. It's called FMHL. So that's actually 100 gigawatt hour storage lake connected to it. So that is around 450 megawatt, and that makes it basically even larger in terms of energy storage capacity. But then also, maybe to be a bit precise, we are not developing many battery projects ourselves. So our business model there is mainly to acquire them as complete as possible from developers, and then maybe, organize the construction ourselves with a few exceptions. Whereas on the hydro side, indeed, we are taking up everything from the early days of developments up to the final commissioning. When you look at the lifespan of a project, so a typical battery project from maybe the project idea or early days of permitting process up to commissioning can be anything between 1 to 4 years. When we make the link to our largest pumped hydro assets, Northwestern in our portfolio, that was a 14 years time frame. So the building permit was granted in 2008 and it was commissioned in 2022. Maybe keeping in mind that it's a 2.2 billion Swiss francs investment. So that also makes it a quite interesting challenge from an investor perspective, because at the time you evaluate the business case or take an investment decision until it's actually materializing, it's 15 years or 14 years, right? So it's a long time. But on the other hand, also the lifespan of the project itself, I mean, hydro plants like that are built for generations, 80 to 100 years lifespan, whereas battery energy storage projects, I mean, typically you calculate with a lifetime of something like 15 years maybe. Then, of course, you can recycle part of it and repower it. But of course, it's still a very different dimension. Last but not least, battery energy storage projects, I mean, they are the same in a way. The technical ingredients of each battery project is the same. You need a grid connection, a piece of land, a trafo, some inverters, some containers or racks with batteries, and you can size them, so more or less of it, or bigger or smaller, but all of the projects are literally the same. And as long as you have the core ingredients sorted out, you can build them literally everywhere. I think it's not hard to understand also for our listeners that, I mean, a pumped hydro storage you can't build in Finland, as an example. You're going to struggle there because you miss the mountains, or you can do it, but it needs a lot of creativity. So obviously it's very much limited by also geographical environment. So there is way less opportunities available to invest or to develop a pumped hydro project today. We do have bigger projects also in Switzerland, and make a link later on to that one. But yeah, the number of projects one can develop is very limited by geographic constraints, and then also by the acceptance in the public. As an example, you can't build a dam in every valley where there is people living and an environment to be protected.
Yes, that makes a lot of sense. You mentioned the massive investment need for a single pumped hydro project. How do you finance such a project?
Yeah, a bit of a Swiss answer to it is what's very common in Switzerland in particular is that, first of all, almost none of the very big assets are owned by one shareholder. It's also not the case, for instance, for Northwestern. So that is an asset which is having 4 different shareholders. So Alpiq is the largest shareholder with, I think you're owning 39%. It still makes it a very sizable investment. But then, I mean, how do you finance it? Yes, you need to have a solid balance sheet. Part of it, it's your own equity you need to provide. And then, of course, you're looking for external financing solutions, but not that fundamentally different to any other infrastructure investment you want to make. The difference is maybe that, I mean, what I see happening on the battery side of the business, there are banks willing to finance a fully merchant BESS at the 50 or 100 megawatt range today and take quite a bit of risk. I mean, you likely won't find that for a pumped hydro storage. So you need to combine the strengths from a company like Alpiq with an own balance sheet and a solid contribution of own equity, a good shareholder structure, and then you can spice that with external financing. And then keep in mind also the project lifetime. I mean, you don't do a one-time financing for a pumped hydro, so you constantly renew your external financing. So you usually have several tranches of bonds, as an example, which you renew on a yearly or bi-yearly basis over time, again and again and again.
I would like to come back to this point that you made, that you see both technologies, so battery and pumped hydro storage, as complements. So we do see this trend in many markets that both the storage duration and battery power is getting bigger and bigger. Would you still say that in the future you would still see them as complements, or will there be more competition?
I think it's really a case-by-case assessment needed. So I think there's not a generic answer. I mean, I struggle to see that the battery can provide a 200-hour storage duration in the very near time frame as our largest pump storage reservoir could do. Even Northwestern with 20 to 24 hour storage duration is quite far away from the current, make it 4 hours, maybe 6 to 8 hours. So I would still see it as a very complementary element. But it's true, I mean, there is a few pump storage projects available or let's say being built, which I would say they are fairly close to a battery capability. And there I think you need to make a bit of a different assessment whether that really makes sense or not. Then, of course, it's again a bit a matter of perspective, because on the very long run, it could still be that over time, a pump storage actually makes a lot of sense. And it's not per se the more expensive solution. But yes, I think there are certain constellations where batteries are getting closer to pump storage. And I think it's also clear that the technology evolution on the battery side will continue. There will be next generations of battery cells or technology coming, which are also supposed to deliver longer energy storage duration. That's definitely something we are very mindful about as Alpiq, and also the projects we are assessing, basically, they are nicely differentiating themselves from a classic battery storage system, as an example.
Mm-hmm. Interesting, thanks. Christoph, you have hands-on experience in trading. So I'm curious to get your insights on how battery and hydropower compare when we come to revenue stacking, optimization, and trading. So we've covered batteries in depth in multiple episodes in this podcast. So could you do a comparison for our listeners between batteries and hydropower? Is there any difference in the trading and the optimization?
Again, it depends. Everybody likes this answer. So it depends a bit on the pumped hydro we're looking at in particular. But the difference is maybe smaller than what many believe. So what I experience a lot is that the capability of a pumped hydro is often underestimated. So especially by, let's say, my battery colleagues. So in terms of, ramping up, ramping down, providing large amounts of flexibility in a very short amount of time, pumped hydro actually can be or is very, very competitive. So it can be very fast. Then not every pumped hydro is the same. So really need to look at the individual constellation. When we look at the revenue stack, first of all, so looking at the market segments which are accessible for pumped hydro or hydro plants, it's more or less the same. So you talk about wholesale markets, day-ahead intraday markets on the short term, as an example. You also look at ancillary service markets, so providing grid stabilization services for grid operators. And you might look at something like a capacity market, which at least in a few markets, both pump storage and battery systems have access to that part of the revenue channel. Then there is a few differences when we zoom in a little bit. What is relatively new, for instance, for the battery side is providing actually grid forming capabilities to the grid. That's something which is given to the hydro plant, so that comes naturally, given by the technology. it's a rather new element on the battery side. Then the other part is we should not forget about that many of the pumped hydro installations, they also have natural inflows, as an example. So it's not just pumping and producing, but you also have inflows. And then it makes it a bit of a different animal because you might have a forward exposure. You want to hedge on the market. You can actually trade forward markets. You can sell part of your energy or hedge a part of your even extrinsic value way more upfront, which typically a battery system is very much acting on the very, very short-term market, except you have a very large portfolio.
So you've mentioned the water inflow into hydro storage. And I think this is a very good point and links nicely to the fact that hydropower is closely tied to nature. And with climate change affecting glaciers and rain patterns, how is that impacting your operation and maybe even project planning?
Maybe to start with a little example, which is very recent. So last weekend, I went for a hike in an area where there is a lots of glaciers and an area I well remember from my childhood. So I kind of have a very exact picture in front of me on how that landscape looked like 30, 35 years ago compared to today. And it's quite impressive in a negative way on how much glaciers are melting away. So the difference is really, really impressive. And also the speed and pace on how that is all accelerating is actually very, very impressive. And now, what does it mean for our hydropower plants, whether it's pumped hydro or just the storage dams and even run-of-river plants? Yeah, it changes a lot because, again, it depends a bit on the individual power plants. So some of the power plants, for instance, they are not exposed to glacier melt because there is no glacier connected to it in a way. So there, the impact of climate change is more on the snowpack side. So you have less snow falling or just in very high altitudes. And the direct impact there is that actually you have way more inflows concentrating in the form of rain in at one point of time. And that also means that, for instance, we have seen record flow rates in our hydro dams in the recent years, something we have never seen in the last decades, because it's all coming together. When you then add power plants which are also exposed to glacier melts, so you might have a warm temperature, which means the ice is melting. You might have not a lot of snow, which is also acting as a kind of natural storage, but it just comes down as rain. And then you have this all together in spring, and you have this really massive flow rates you see. And in the, call it good old times, both snowpack and glaciers, they function like an additional storage. So it helps you to distribute the inflows over the season. So you would see that there's the rain coming in the spring, and you're profiting from that rain, which you can then transform into energy. And later in the season, the warm temperature would, melt the snow, melt the ice, and it led to a nice distribution of inflows. And that's more and more concentrating just in the spring, even early spring. And it also means that suddenly the storage capacity of our dams becomes too little because it was not designed for these massive flow rates in the early spring. There is lots of other effects. So for instance, sediments. So you have way more sediments in the water because of that heavy rain coming down. So it means you need to clean your power plants or the dams way more often. And outside of power generation, that became very, very visible in the last years. Massive amounts of landslides, flash floods, destruction down to entire villages, half of mountains coming down. It's quite remarkable what's happening right now. But maybe making here a positive link to the function of a hydropower plant. So the biggest dam project in Switzerland is a 600 gigawatt reservoir project near Zermatt, so close to the famous Matterhorn. And that project is also, let's say, with Alpiq or with the extended perimeter of Alpiq. But that project will have a very important role beside of pure electricity storage. It will also prevent flash floods. So it will be also used for water management because it can hold back water for a certain time and avoids that immense amounts of water are going down at the wrong moment of time. And we see that is an increasing need, but also an increasing purpose of our hydropower dams in the Alps, that they can be used for intelligent water management and have suddenly also a very different added value than a pure electricity storage or electricity generation purpose.
That is very interesting. And I've read that some people call pumped hydro the Swiss Army knife of the energy transition. I think after what you just told me, there's even more reason to call it that. So, Christoph, we've discussed batteries and hydropower and compared their different advantages and disadvantages. Taking all of this into account and linking back to my question of David versus Goliath, what would you say is Alpiq's most valuable asset?
I like the question, and maybe the answer is surprising, because I believe the most valuable asset we have in our portfolio has nothing to do with megawatt or megawatt hours and nothing to do with any electrons. I really believe our most valuable asset in the portfolio is actually our people. We are investing a lot in a cultural transformation of our company. So we don't want to be the classic utility. We will not be, and we are not the classical utility. We want to be more agile. We have to be more agile, and we invest a lot in a cultural transformation right now. Why is that? Because we believe actually the only asset which can not be headhunted is our culture. So that is an asset we really want to preserve, and we invest a lot. For that reason, we have teamed up with IMD as an example. We have started with the entire leadership population, and it's a longer journey, I would say, because you don't transform culture overnight. It might be a journey which never ends, but the ambition here is really to be a different kind of energy. And I think we are on a good path there to make our company a good place of work, or maybe a better place to work than our competitors. Then, yes, we are still fascinated by the megawatt and megawatt hours, but I would like really to make the link to the human being easier.
Thank you for this charming answer, Christoph.
Yeah, so thank you very much for having me.
And this brings us to the end of our podcast. Thanks for tuning in to this episode of Energy Unplugged today.
That was Claudia Günther, Aurora's Senior Research Lead for Northwestern Europe, talking to Christoph Bellin, Head of Development and Projects at Alpiq, Executive Vice President. Thanks for listening to Energy Unplugged. Do keep an eye on our podcast feed for more in-depth conversations with senior members of the energy industry. The best way to do this is to follow the podcast via whatever platform you use.